This morning's sermon, again in Lamentations, I've just titled Faithfulness. Lamentations is the poetry of pain. Just listen to it again. I am the man who has been afflicted by the rod of his wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old, and he has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with chains. Even when I call out or I cry for help, he shuts out my prayer. He has barred my way with blocks of stone. He has made my paths crooked. It's strange, isn't it, how suffering draws poetry out of the human spirit. I mean, just think of some of the amazing poetry that was written during World War I, one of the worst of all wars. For example, what passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the stuttering of rifles rapping rattle can patter out their hasty horizons. Somehow it harnesses the raw emotion into a literary form, and it allows us to cope with it, but to measure it and to survey it. The measured tread of a poem's rhyme and rhythm provide dignity and weight to what would otherwise escalate into an agony or a scream. I mean, think of Thomas Gray's elegy in a country churchyard. The paths of glory lead but to the grave. Or James Shirley, the glories of our blood and state are shadows, not substantial things. There is no armour against fate. Death lays his icy hands on kings. Sceptre and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with the poor crooked scythe and spade. Or in the Bible, think of David's lament over the deaths of Saul and Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. The glory of Israel is slain on your high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. And here in Lamentations, probably the Bible's least commented on book. I hope those of you who were here last week did try and read a little bit of it last week. If not, I hope you'll read a little bit before next week. The only way to appreciate poetry is to read it. Maybe even read it aloud and then read it again. In chapter 3, there's a particular elaborate poetic form, what's known as a triple acrostic. There's 66 verses in 3-verse stanzas. The first word of each verse of each stanza begins with the same Hebrew letter, working through the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. The change from chapters 1 and 2, which were just simple acrostics, not triple acrostic, signals to us that we're right in the heart of the book, and we're still naming the pain in verses 1 to 18, in these first 18 verses. And it's quite close to a scream. So verse 10, like a bear lying in wait, like a lion in hiding, he dragged me from the path and mangled me and left me without help. He drew his bow and made me the target for his arrows. He pierced my heart with arrows from his quiver. I became the laughingstock of all my people. They mocked me in song all day long. He has filled me with bitter herbs and sated me with gall. He has broken my teeth with gravel. He has trampled me in the dust. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say, my splendour is gone, and all that I had hoped from the Lord. This is more personal, isn't it, than chapters 1 and 2. An individual seems to be speaking here, and the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians in 587 BC is no longer the foreground of the poem as it was earlier. But the language is, if anything, even more violent, and the emotions just so raw. And there is someone to blame. God is the subject of nearly every verb for the first 16 verses of this chapter. So verse 2, he has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than the light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He has made my skin and my flesh grow old and has broken my bones. He has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. The poet is absolutely clear about the sovereignty of God over his suffering. The little green fish, do you remember this from last week? The little green fish that is you and me as we make our way through life. And then the second fish is the circumstances of life that frequently overwhelm and swallow us up. But what we must remember is that there's something or someone far greater than the circumstances of our lives. The sovereignty of the living God. He doesn't mention his punishment for sin until he gets to verse 39, where we read, "Why should any living man complain when punished for his sins? Let us examine our ways and test them. Let us return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven and say, we have sinned and rebelled, and you have not forgiven." But God is so clearly the agent of their disaster. Yet note the poet's pen doesn't cause him to deny God. If anything, he acknowledges the reality of God in the experience of the pain in his suffering. And suffering's like that, isn't it? One of my old rugby coaches was among the first Allied troops to enter Belsen in the closing months of the Second World War. At the time when the rest of the world had no idea of Adolf Hitler's final solution. When they reached those extermination camps like Auschwitz and Belsen, the Allies didn't have a clue what they'd discover. And it came as a total surprise and mystery to them. You may have seen the same scene in the Band of Brothers when Easy Company was made a similar discovery. Now that experience was so awful, so unbelievable that men could commit such atrocities that it caused my coach to reconsider what to do with his whole life. And when he got back to England, he offered himself for ordination within the Church of England. We need to face up to suffering, and we need to name the pain and look grief straight in the face, because that is the reality of human life on this planet. It's not easy for us to grasp in such a comfortable and cocoon society that you and I find ourselves in if we're citizens of the Western world. But that is the reality of human life on this planet. And it need not drive us away from God, because getting rid of God will not get rid of the pain. It just makes the pain meaningless. And the pain's not meaningless for Lamentations. Notice the change there is around verse 21. I'll start at verse 17. I've been deprived of peace. I've forgotten what prosperity is. So I say my splendour is gone, and all that I hope from the Lord. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness of the gall. I remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. Verse 21, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. So in verses 19 to 42, we're using the memory. And this is where we get to the heart of the whole book. Not just this chapter, but the whole book. Remember that the Hebrew mind often puts the climax at the centre rather than at the end of a book like we do. First, there's this involuntary remembering in verses 19 and 20. I remember my affliction and my wandering, the bitterness and the gall. I remember them, and my soul is downcast within me. He couldn't help remembering his calamity. It was overwhelming and all-absorbing. But it's also possible to use the memory actively. So verse 21, yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. You see, nothing's changed in his circumstances or his feelings, but he's chose to turn from introspection to contemplation of God. He chose to call God to mind, God's character, God's nature, God's word. There's no shutting of the eyes to the reality of suffering. After all, we've had 2.5 unrelieved chapters of it by now. But in the midst of his affliction, he deliberately turned his mind also to God. Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope, because the Lord's great love we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. I say to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is young. The substance of hope does not lie in his decision to remember, his choice. It lies in what is that he has chosen to remember. The love, the compassion, and the faithfulness of his God. Because of the Lord's great love, we're not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. It's been said that even to be able to lament is a gift. Barry Webb writes, to weep is to be alive, and to that extent at least an object of divine grace. But much more than that, the poet makes himself focus on God's true character. He sets the memory of that alongside the reality of his present suffering. He remembers them both, not just one of them. And when we do that, we realise that there's hope for us in the nature of God. Verse 31, for men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. You see, there may actually be no hope for us in our present circumstances, in our pain, in our grief, in our despair, the misery that we may find ourselves in. Nor will we perhaps find any hope in ourselves, because through even in bad circumstances, I may be cheery and full of beans one minute, but I can be miserable as sin the next. Because we human beings, we're up and down like that, aren't we? And sin is just the point. Because when faced with the greatness, the glory, the goodness, the holiness, the majesty of God, I have to know that I've fallen short. I know that I failed. That I am what the Bible calls a sinner. I don't actually deserve a happy life, do I? Because we have often known what was good and the right thing to do, but we haven't done it. I've not said it, and I certainly have not thought it in the right way. We often think that the issue is, shall I decide to have a relationship with God or not? But actually, it's not my decision to take. I deciding to have a relationship with God is a little bit like a gazelle deciding to have a relationship with the local lions. It's not an option open to the gazelle, except for a running away and trying not to be killed kind of a relationship. The decision does not lie with the gazelle, nor does it lie with us. The issue is, will God have a relationship with me? And the answer lies in his character, his nature revealed to us in his word. Look again at these wonderful verses. Verse 22, because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed. For his compassions never fail. They knew every morning, great is your faithfulness. I said to myself, the Lord is my portion, therefore I will wait for him. The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him, the one who seeks him. And, verse 31, for men are not cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men. And you and I have even more wonderful evidence of God's character in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are looking back through the cross, and as I look at the cross of Christ, I see God's fury unleashed on my sin. Exactly what I deserve for my selfishness, and it's taken for me by God himself in the person of his son Jesus. How awesome is that? So my very judge, with his awful justice, is also my only hope and my never-failing compassion. In terms of my rather foolish diagram, we need to think of one of those little fish which swims safely around the jaws of some great savage predatory fish, like a pilot fish with a shark, or a cleaner wrasse in the jaws of a moray eel. But remember these two memories, one of harsh circumstances dealt out by God, and the other of a God of love and compassion who offers us forgiveness. See, those two memories have to be held side by side. If we're only open to the second, the love of God, and will not hear the first, God's just judgment on sin, we'll never find the second experience, that second memory. It only lies alongside the first, which is why the way to it is to humble ourselves. Verse 28, let him sit alone in silence, for the Lord has laid it on him. Let him bury his face in the dust, there may yet be hope. Let him offer his cheek to one who would strike him, and let him be filled with disgrace. You see, to humble ourselves and to confess. Verse 40, let us examine our ways and test them. Let us return to the Lord. Let us lift up our hearts and our hands to God in heaven and say, we have sinned and rebelled, and you have not forgiven. You see, confession springs out of double remembering. The memory of what I deserve and the memory of what God is prepared to give. And we need to exercise it often. We need to bring both memories to mind, what I deserve and what God gives me. But notice how the act of confessing sin seems to take the poem back into despair. We've sinned and rebelled, and you've not forgiven. You've covered yourself with anger and pursued us. You are slain without pity. You have covered yourself with a cloud so that no prayer can get through. You've made us scum and refuge among the nations. All our enemies have opened their mouths wide against us. We have suffered terror and pitfalls, ruin and destruction. Streams of tears flow from my eyes because my people are destroyed. My eyes will flow unceasingly without relief until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. What I see brings grief to my soul because all the women of my city, those who were my enemies without cause, hunted me like a bird. They tried to end my life in a pit and threw stones at me. The waters closed over my head, and I thought I was about to be cut off. Grief is like that, isn't it? Crying out in the dark. It can sweep up suddenly, without warning, and engulf us in desperation, as bitter as when it first struck. Anyone who's lost a close relative or a friend will know that grief is like it sweeps up suddenly without warning, and it engulfs us in desperation. And lamentation ebbs and flows like human grief. But after this midway point in the poem, the lament cannot quite be as it was before. Verse 49, my eyes will flow unceasingly, without relief, until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees. Verse 55, I call on your name, O Lord, from the depths of the pit. You heard my plea. Do not close your ears to my cry for relief. You came near when I called you, and you said, do not fear. O Lord, you took up my case. You redeemed my life. You have seen, O Lord, the wrong done to me. Uphold my cause. You see, from now on, we're going to hear the memory of redemption alongside the experience of suffering. The changing voices in the poem, sometimes it's in the singular I, sometimes it's in the plural we, teach us to handle grief and hardship continually, is together. The Bible neither explains nor eliminates suffering, but the Bible shows us that God shares our human suffering. He has borne our grief and carries our sorrows, and it's seen no more than in the cross of Christ. And we're to share one another's suffering. And that's a great thing to remember at a time like this. We're to share one another's suffering. Sometimes it's all we can do for the sufferer to enter a little way into the pain with him or her and to sit with them. Don't ask yourself, what can I say? Just sit with them. It may be your company will be far more comforting than your words. Job's comforters did more for him in the first 7 days they sat with him in silence than they did in the 30 chapters of words that follow. Now, not all of us will plumb the agonizing depths of suffering which this book reveals. But every one of us can know the faithfulness of God in the circumstances of our lives. We can grasp there is a God sovereign over it all. And this is what Lamentation points us to. Thomas Chisholm, who lived between 1866 and 1960, which was a good life, he wrote the great hymn with which we're going to sing shortly. And he said that it was not written as a result of a spiritual crisis in some sharp agony of the soul, when pain and despair threatened to drown him, but it was written as a testimony. He said, the unfailing faithfulness of a covenant-keeping God who has given me many wonderful displays of his providing care, which have filled me with astonishing gratefulness. That is an experience that every one of us can have day by day. And so we can sing with our hearts. And so let's do that right now. Let's sing, "Great is thy faithfulness, O God my Father." And then after that, we're going to have a short time of saying goodbye to our friends, Owen and Linda Dutton. But let's sing, "Great is thy faithfulness."